the man who made Rome flinch. You think you know Attila the Hun. You picture the squat, savage man on a shaggy horse, burning cities because he could not think of anything better to do. Here is the problem. Nearly every popular image of Attila was invented by people who hated him and needed him to be a monster for their own political and religious reasons. The real Attila was something considerably more unsettling. He was one of the most effective political operators of the 5th century, a man who understood Roman bureaucracy well enough to extort it for decades, who turned the threat of violence into a financial instrument so effective that Constantinople paid him protection money for years. Attila did not burn civilization. He squeezed it until it bled gold, and Rome wrote him letters asking him to please stop. That story is more interesting and more true, but to get there, you need to understand where he came from, which is, predictably, where things immediately fall apart, who the Huns actually were, and why nobody can agree. The Huns appear in Roman historical records the way a fire appears in a library. Suddenly, catastrophically, and with no good explanation of how it started. In the 370s, they materialize north of the Black Sea and begin hitting the Gothic kingdom so hard that entire populations start moving south and west to get away from them. This movement of peoples, the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and others flooding into Roman territory, this is one of the events that historians point to as a structural cause of the Western Empire's eventual collapse. The Huns did not directly topple Rome, they just created the pressure that made everything downstream go wrong. Where the Huns came from before that is genuinely contested. For most of the 20th century, the popular theory connected them to the Xiongnu, a nomadic confederation that had been harassing the Han dynasty in China for centuries. The Xiongnu disappear from Chinese records. The Huns appear in European ones. The timeline roughly matches. Many historians said they traveled west and became the Huns. Modern scholarship has complicated this significantly. Genetic studies of burial sites associated with Hunnic populations show a diverse mix of ancestries rather than a single ethnic group traveling intact from Central Asia. The Huns appear to have been, like most steppe confederacies, a political entity that absorbed multiple populations under a common leadership structure and military culture. There may have been an original core group. There was certainly a ruling elite with shared customs and language. But the clean migration story, Xiongnu pack up and arrive in Europe rebranded, is almost certainly too neat. What is not contested is the effect. By the late 4th century, the Huns were the dominant military force on the Eurasian steppe, and their presence caused a cascade of refugee crises that Roman border policy was completely unprepared for. The Battle of Adrianople in 378, where the Visigoths killed the Emperor Valens, happened in large part because Rome's handling of Gothic refugees was catastrophically bad. The Huns caused the Goths to move. The Goths moving broke something in Roman border security that was never fully repaired. Roman sources describing the Huns are almost uniformly horrified and almost uniformly unreliable. Ammianus Marcellinus describes them as barely human, eating raw meat, never dismounting, born in the saddle. Most of this is the standard toolkit ancient writers used for peoples they feared. Foreigners who frightened Romans tended to acquire animal-adjacent characteristics in Roman prose. Keep that in mind every time a 5th century source tells you something about Hunnic behavior. The brothers, the treaty, and the tribute machine. By the early 5th century, the Huns had consolidated their control over a vast territory stretching from the steppes east of the Carpathians through much of what is now Hungary. The leadership structure was not a single monarchy in the modern sense, but a confederation of tribal groups under overlapping authority, which is why the early 5th century sees multiple Hunnic leaders appearing in Roman sources rather than one dominant king. Attila's uncle Rua, sometimes spelled Rugila, was the dominant Hunnic leader by the 420s. He had already established the pattern that Attila would later perfect, extracting tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire in exchange for not attacking and periodically renegotiating that arrangement upward. The Eastern Empire, whose capital was Constantinople and which was considerably richer and more administratively functional than the western half, found it useful to pay. This seems humiliating in retrospect. At the time, it was rational cost-benefit analysis. The Huns were formidable. Gold was easier to produce than soldiers. Rua died around 434. His nephews, Attila and Bleda, inherited joint leadership and within months negotiated the Treaty of Margus with the Eastern Empire. The terms set the template for everything that followed. The Eastern Empire agreed to pay an annual tribute of around 700 pounds of gold, not harbor Hunnic refugees or political rivals, and return any fugitives who had fled to Roman territory. In exchange, the Huns maintained peace along the Danube frontier and allowed Roman merchants to trade at Hunnic-controlled markets. 700 pounds of gold was manageable against the Eastern Empire's revenues. The Romans paid it, grumbled about it in writing, and got on with their lives. Attila and Bleda used the tribute period to consolidate power, expand territory, and build the military capacity that made Attila's later campaigns possible. Bleda died around 445. The sources say nothing useful about the circumstances. Some later writers suggest Attila had him killed. This is plausible. Fratricide among steppe rulers was not uncommon, and Attila subsequently took sole control. But the evidence is thin enough that reputable historians treat it as speculation. Attila emerged from this period as the sole and undisputed ruler of the most powerful military force between the Rhine and the Central Asian steppes, and he proceeded to use that position with considerable skill. How you squeeze an empire without starting a war. The period from roughly 440 to 450 is when Attila perfected the technique that made him effective, using the threat of overwhelming violence to extract concessions without actually having to fight most of the time. The Eastern Empire was the primary target, and the mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. Step 1. Identify a pretext. The Treaty of Margus had included provisions about returning Hunnic refugees. The Eastern Empire was almost certainly not fully complying. Attila would accuse them of violations, demand renegotiation, and use the diplomatic dispute to justify military pressure along the Danube frontier. Step 2. Demonstrate capability. When demonstration was required, Attila's forces were genuinely devastating. The campaigns of 441 to 443 against the Eastern Empire resulted in the sacking of multiple major cities, including Naissus, the birthplace of Constantine the Great, and Serdica, now Sofia. The Roman historian Priscus, who later visited Attila's court, and whose account is the single most valuable primary source we have for this period, describes seeing the banks of the river at Naissus still littered with bones from the massacre, years after the attack. This was not exaggeration for effect. Attila's campaigns caused real destruction and real death. Step 3. Negotiate upward. After sufficient demonstration of what non-compliance looked like, Attila would accept a new treaty at higher terms. The annual tribute was renegotiated to 1,400 pounds of gold after the 441 to 443 campaigns, and then to 2,100 pounds following a second round of military pressure in 447. He also extracted the right to a 30-mile exclusion zone south of the Danube, from which Roman forces had to withdraw, and continued demands for the return of refugees and the punishment of Roman officials he considered hostile. This is tribute extraction as a systematic strategy, not raiding for plunder. Attila was running a protection racket on continental scale, and he was doing it through a combination of genuine military power and sophisticated diplomatic theater. His court at this time employed Roman-educated secretaries, received Roman ambassadors, and engaged in formal diplomatic correspondence that followed standard Roman protocols. Priscus, when he visited in 449 as part of an Eastern Roman diplomatic mission, described a court that was hierarchical, ceremonially elaborate, and perfectly capable of conducting business in Greek and Latin. The image of Attila as someone who had wandered out of a primordial darkness into contact with civilization is wrong. He had grown up in an environment that was already deeply entangled with Rome, had possibly spent time at the Roman court as a hostage or diplomatic guest in his youth, and understood exactly how Roman administrative and diplomatic culture worked. He used that understanding against Rome consistently and effectively, the Priscus account and what it actually shows. The best primary source we have for Attila at his peak is a historian named Priscus, who visited the court in 449 as part of an Eastern Roman diplomatic mission. The real purpose of the mission was grimmer than it appeared. Elements within the Eastern Roman court had proposed assassinating Attila, and the delegation was partly cover. Attila found out. The plot collapsed. Priscus got a detailed look at the Hunnic court anyway. What he describes is not a warlord's camp. It is an organized settlement with large halls, a clear social hierarchy, ceremonial protocols, and a feast where toasts were offered in strict order of status. Attila himself was notably plain by comparison to his subordinates, simple clothes, simple tableware, which reads more like deliberate image management than poverty. What is most striking in Priscus's account is a Greek merchant he encounters, who had been captured at Naissus, had entered Hunnic service, done well, and had absolutely no interest in being repatriated. He told Priscus that justice in Attila's territory was more reliable than in the Roman Empire, where the wealthy corrupted the courts. Whether accurate or rationalization, it is a data point that complicates the civilization versus barbarism frame entirely. The Western campaign and the thing nobody tells you about the battle. By 450, the geopolitical situation had shifted. The Eastern Empire under the Emperor Marcian had decided to stop paying tribute. Marcian told Attila, essentially, that he could take his demands and manage them himself. This was a significant change in policy, and it forced Attila to pivot his focus. Attacking a Constantinople that was now heavily fortified and had a new and less pliable emperor was a less attractive proposition than it had been under Theodosius II. Attila turned west. The pretext was complicated. There was a Visigothic king named Theodoric, whose kingdom occupied much of what is now southwestern France and northern Spain. There was the Western Roman court at Ravenna, increasingly managed by a general named Aetius, who had ironically spent years as a hostage at the Hunnic court in his youth. and understood Hunnic military methods better than almost anyone in the Roman world. And there was a remarkable letter that Attila received from Honoria, the sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III, who had gotten herself into serious trouble, and apparently sent Attila a ring, along with what he chose to interpret as a marriage proposal, and a claim to half the Western Empire as her dowry. Historians debate how seriously to take the Honoria episode. Attila certainly used it as diplomatic leverage and a justification for his invasion. Whether Honoria actually intended a marriage proposal, or was asking for protection from a political situation gone wrong, and whether Attila genuinely believed he had a legitimate claim, or was using it as convenient theater, cannot be determined from surviving sources. What is clear is that by 451, Attila had crossed the Rhine with an enormous force and was moving through Gaul. The subsequent campaign was devastating to the regions it passed through, but did not result in the conquest of Gaul. Attila was stopped at the Catalonian plains, and the location of this battle is still debated by historians, somewhere in northeastern France, in a confrontation with a coalition force under Aetius that included Visigoths, Alans, and various Roman allied groups. The Visigoths under Theodoric fought at the center. Theodoric was killed during the battle. Here is the thing nobody explains properly about the Catalonian plains. It was not a clean Roman victory. Attila's forces were not destroyed. Attila himself retreated in good order, and his army remained functional. Aetius, despite having the opportunity to press the attack, did not pursue aggressively. Some historians think this was a strategic calculation. Aetius may have wanted to preserve Hunnic military power as a counterweight to the Visigoths, whose growing strength in Gaul made them a long-term problem for Roman authority. If the Huns were completely destroyed, the Visigoths would become the dominant power in the region, which was not necessarily in Rome's interest. Whether that interpretation is correct, or whether Aetius simply felt his coalition had achieved enough and lacked the strength to press further, is debated. What is clear is that Attila survived the Catalonian plains fully capable of continuing to fight, and in 452 he proved it by invading Italy. Italy, the Pope, and the meeting that history misremembered. The Italian campaign of 452 is where Attila's legend was most durably shaped by later tradition. He crossed the Alps, besieged and took Aquileia, a major city at the head of the Adriatic that was so thoroughly destroyed it essentially never recovered, its refugees reportedly founding settlements in the lagoons that would eventually become Venice, and moved south through the Po Valley. Then he stopped. He did not march on Rome. He retreated back north and died the following year without ever having entered the city. Why? The traditional answer, preserved in Catholic tradition and enthusiastically promoted by the medieval church, is that Pope Leo I met Attila near Mantua and talked him out of it. The meeting happened. It is attested in multiple sources. Leo, described as an impressive and authoritative figure, led a diplomatic delegation. Attila subsequently withdrew. Therefore, the argument goes, Leo's moral authority and divine backing convinced the feared conqueror to stand down. The secular historical answer is considerably more prosaic. Attila's army was suffering from disease and supply problems. A previous occasion when a northern army had sacked Rome, the Visigoths in 410, had been followed by plague in the invading force. Attila may have known this precedent and been cautious about repeating it. The Eastern Emperor Marcian had also sent forces to strike at Hunnic territory north of the Danube while Attila was occupied in Italy, which created pressure on his home base, and Italy had been extensively stripped of movable wealth and food during the campaign. There was increasingly little to gain by pushing further south at significant cost. The Leo meeting probably mattered at the margin. A powerful figure willing to negotiate, combined with practical military and logistical constraints, gives a commander a face-saving reason to do what he probably needed to do anyway. But the idea that Leo's eloquence alone turned back Attila's army is religious hagiography, not history. It served the church's purposes to portray Leo as possessing supernatural persuasive power. It served nobody's interest except accuracy to note that Attila's army was sick, hungry, and facing a secondary military threat from the east, the death that stopped everything. Attila died in 453. He died on the night of his marriage to a woman named Ildico, in circumstances that have fueled historical gossip for 15 centuries. He was found dead in bed with blood coming from his nose and mouth, and Ildico was reportedly found in the room weeping. The ancient sources differ on what happened. The most common explanation accepted by modern historians is that Attila died of a severe nosebleed. Medically, esophageal hemorrhage related to heavy alcohol consumption. On his wedding night, he drank heavily at the feast, went to bed, and bled to death internally while unconscious. This is consistent with what the sources describe, and and with what is known about the medical consequences of severe alcoholism. Some ancient writers suggested Ildiko killed him. This accusation appears in sources hostile to the Huns, and fits suspiciously neatly into the woman takes revenge narrative that ancient and medieval writers were extremely fond of. There is no compelling evidence for it, and it requires Ildiko to have committed murder under circumstances where discovery was essentially guaranteed and then remained in the room rather than fleeing. The hemorrhage explanation requires no such contortions. The response to Attila's death was immediate and dramatic. According to Priscus's account of the funeral, and here the sources are at least consistent, Attila's warriors cut their hair and slashed their faces to mourn him, preferring to display grief in blood rather than tears, because he deserved to be mourned by warriors. His body was placed in 3 coffins, nested inside each other, of iron, silver, and gold. He was buried at night, with the slaves who dug the grave killed afterward to keep the location secret. No confirmed burial site has ever been found. Then his sons started fighting over the succession, and within a year the Hunnic Confederation had effectively collapsed. The empire that could not outlast the man. The fragmentation after Attila's death was swift and total. He left multiple sons from multiple wives, and the Hunnic system of power had no mechanism for stable succession beyond the personal authority of the ruler. His sons, Elek, Dengizic, and Ernek, all competed for primacy. The subject, peoples who had been held in the confederation by Attila's force of personality and military dominance, saw their opportunity and took it. The Gepids led a revolt at the Battle of Nidau in 454, within a year of Attila's death, and the Hunnic forces were decisively defeated. Elek was killed. The confederation broke apart. The Huns never again dominated European politics. This collapse tells you something important about what Attila had actually built. He had constructed an empire of personal authority, held together by his own effectiveness as a ruler and military commander, by the fear he inspired and the rewards he distributed, by his skill at balancing the competing interests of subordinate groups. He had not built institutions. He had not created a succession system. He had not established anything that could function without him at its center. By Roman imperial standards, this was a failure of statesmanship. By the standards of steppe confederacy politics, it was simply how the system worked. These confederacies rose and fell with dominant personalities. Attila happened to be more dominant and to last longer than most. When he was gone, there was nothing to hold it together, because he had never tried to build something that would outlast him. He had been too busy using it. What the mythology tells you about everyone except Attila. The transformation of Attila into mythological figures after his death says more about the cultures that did the transforming than it does about the man himself. In Germanic tradition, Attila becomes Etzel in the Nibelungenlied, a relatively sympathetic figure, a powerful king whose court contains heroes and whose tragedy is that he cannot control the catastrophic conflict that erupts there. This Attila is generous, measured, and ultimately a victim of events rather than a cause of them. The Germanic peoples who had lived alongside the Huns and sometimes served under Attila processed him as a complex figure who could be admired in certain respects. In Roman and later Western Christian tradition, Attila becomes the scourge of God, a term that appears in sources from shortly after his death, and that was enthusiastically embraced by the medieval church. The logic of the scourge of God framing is theologically elegant. Attila's devastation is not a failure of Roman defense or divine favor, but an instrument of divine punishment for Roman sinfulness. God sent Attila to chastise Christians who had strayed. This interpretation makes Attila terrifying but also, paradoxically, subject to divine authority, which is why Leo could turn him away. The church needed a story where Christianity had power over the most frightening force of the age. The Scourge of God narrative provided one. In Hungarian tradition, Attila becomes a founding ancestor whose conquest legitimized Hungarian authority in Europe. The medieval court found it useful to be descended from a man who had terrified Constantinople. None of these figures is Attila. They are projections of other people's needs onto a man who had been dead long enough to be used for whatever purpose the projectors required. What is actually left when you clear the mythology? The real Attila is harder to summarize than the mythological one, which is probably why the mythology persists. He was genuinely formidable. He took a confederation that his uncle had built into a major power and extended its reach and revenue extraction to a degree no previous Hunnic ruler had achieved, through a combination of military effectiveness and sophisticated understanding of Roman political weaknesses. He was also responsible for real destruction. The sacking of Naissus, the devastation of Aquileia, the campaigns through the Balkans were not propaganda. People died. Cities were destroyed. The bones Priscus saw on the riverbank were not a metaphor. He was not the destroyer of Rome. The Western Empire's structural problems preceded him, and its final collapse in 476 came more than 2 decades after his death. He accelerated some pressures and destabilized some boundaries. That is different from causing the fall. He built something that could not survive him. The Hunnic Confederation required an Attila to function. When he was gone, there was nothing to hold it together, because he had never tried to build something that would outlast him. He had been too busy using it. The man who sat in a wooden hall in the Pannonian Plain and dictated diplomatic correspondence to Roman secretaries was not the mindless barbarian of Roman propaganda. He was considerably more complicated and considerably more capable. History has been telling the wrong story about Attila for 15 centuries because the wrong story was more useful to the people telling it. The bones at Nisus were real. So was the man who put them there. He was not what you were told, and the distance between what you were told and what he actually was is exactly the distance between the history that is comfortable and the history that is true.